Nataraj is the host of Startup Project podcast. He is an investor at Incisive VC, an angel investor, and a product manager. All opinions expressed by Nataraj and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of the firms they work with. This podcast is informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Nataraj and guests may maintain positions in the companies or securities discussed on this podcast. To learn more, visit thestartupproject.io.
Welcome to another episode of Startup Project. This week on the show, we have Ian from Highscore, which is a company that is pioneering how we play games in the future. So I think this will be an interesting episode where we talk about all things gaming industry. What is the value chain like? What is the business models of the industry? And I think a whole lot more interesting things around gaming. With that, Ian, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Really glad to be here.
So just to set the context for our listeners, can you give a little bit background of who you are? What was your journey before starting Highscore, and how did you, enter into gaming industry?
Sure. I'm a second-time founder, first-time CEO. I previously started a company my sophomore year of college at Dartmouth. Ran that for about 4 or 5 years. We were based out of the Research Triangle area of North Carolina. We ended up getting acquired in 2019 by a PayFac based in South Carolina. And then after that, worked on a variety of open source projects, had some interesting consulting opportunities, had a unique chance to work with one of the original authors of DirectX, which was a really awesome experience. And then about a year and a half ago, decided to start Highscore, which is a new cloud gaming company that we're in the process of spinning up.
What were the open source projects that you were primarily interested back then?
There's a variety of things, mostly around like different network tools and concepts that, I had just been sort of like ruminating on. There were like a number of ideas we had kind of kicked around at my previous startup, just on the engineering team. And I just was collaborating with a couple of folks from, Orchard on these new open source projects. It's just really like a fun time. One of the things we put together was like a open source peer-to-peer VPN project. Learned a lot doing that. It didn't work super well, but it was a fun experience nonetheless.
Nice. So can you give a little bit peek into like how did you come across, get into gaming industry? Like why start something in gaming?
Sure.
And what was your thought process like for that?
Definitely. I've been a gamer my entire life. Going back to, I can remember my 5th Christmas, my aunt gave my parents a purple Game Boy to give to me. It was a Game Boy Color. And I got it for about an hour on Christmas morning. And then my parents took it away and I never saw it again. So I think I've sort of had this like pent up demand around video games my entire life because, when I was growing up, a lot of the time that I spent playing games was, over at friends' houses, which was super fun because it kind of worked pretty well because my friends would have like a console at home, so they'd be able to play all the time. And the only time I would get to play was when I was over at their place. So like a lot of times, basically, my friends would just kick my butt constantly in games. And, they were happy because they got to win and I was happy because I got to play. So I kind of had this maybe deprived childhood of gaming, which sort of made me really want to be in games more. I just have a real passionate love for games my entire life. And when I got a MacBook when I was in middle school for the first time, I think for a little bit, I kind of went off the deep end with gaming. And I can remember there were a handful of times where, especially with the first BioShock is a good example, I sat down to start playing the game. And I don't know how much time passed, but I didn't get up until I completed the game. And just a lot of experiences like that. And I've been sort of an avid collector of games for many years now. So just the opportunity to work on something in gaming is a real dream come true for me. And I'm very happy to be able to do it.
So you wanted to do something in gaming, because of all this passion. So tell us a little bit about, what does Highscore aim to do right now, and what is the product like? And was
Sure.
that the same original idea that you guys started with, or did you have to like change over time and iterate and come up with what it is right now?
Sure. Yeah. So with High Score, our ambition is to eventually allow people to play any PC game on any device. There's a huge back catalog of PC games, hundreds of thousands of games that, for many people just aren't accessible for one reason or another, whether they don't have a gaming PC, um, they primarily, game on their phone, they don't have a console, or, their daily driver is an iPad. I'm very much in the camp where I would love to be able to ditch my MacBook and live off an iPad. But one of the big things sort of holding that back is gaming, where, I want to be able to play AAA games, and, that's not really possible to do on an iPad in a really meaningful way. So with High Score, that's really our ambition, is to sort of make it possible for people to, access games wherever they are, and sort of meet people where they are for gaming, and sort of democratize access to PC games, as it were. Um,
So the
yeah,
blocker for playing, or like, ditching your MacBook and just continuing with the iPad, like if taking that analogy, what is the blocker for games to be not working on an iPad versus working on a MacBook? Like, what are the limiting factors there?
sure. It basically comes down to compatibility. Most games are developed for Windows first, and then typically ported to whatever, form factors the company decides they want to support subsequently. Oftentimes, even if it's a console game, and it comes to console first, it's originally developed on Windows. If and when it ever comes to Apple devices, it's usually much later. And historically, it's kind of interesting. Like Apple devices are actually the original market for PC gaming, and for a variety of reasons over the years, that's stopped being true. But today, basically, if support ever comes to a Mac for a game, it's much later, if it ever comes. And devices like Chromebooks, it's just not really feasible. There's a lot of reasons for this, largely to do with, the support different game engines that a lot of modern games are built on, like what they support as like export targets, and sort of the challenges involved with, compatibility. A big part of the reason that you don't see like a lot of Windows games coming to Mac is, performance issues. So like a lot of times games require pretty significant tweaks in order to be ported from one platform to another. And developers, in a lot of ways are limited in terms of resources. Games are incredibly expensive to make these days, especially at the AAA level. And, that, cost factor is not really coming down over time. It's rising, as, fidelity requirements keep increasing, the cost to make games keeps going up. And so, when you're considering, the investment in which platforms to bring your game to, that's like a real factor to consider. So, if you have guaranteed success, and that, historically like 90% of the market for games has been on Windows, for whatever reason that might be, it's a lot harder to sort of make the case that you're going to bring your games to these alternative devices, where they might not be well supported.
So it's almost like a funnel situation where a game first goes to Windows, and if it is super successful and widely adopted, then they go into other channels like Mac and iPad
Exactly.
or iOS or
Exactly.
Android, right?
But
Eventually.
many games never breach that gap. They never make the jump. They, reach a niche audience on Windows and stay there. And they remain inaccessible to a huge chunk of people. Like if you look at sort of the market for desktops these days, it's very interesting because, Steam does like a hardware survey every month, and they publish the results of this, and you can kind of like look into it and see, where people are accessing Steam. And, like 90% of it's on Windows, which is crazy because Windows, in terms of consumer desktop, only makes up about 60% of the market. The other 40% is about 20% MacBook, 20% Chromebook. Um, so there's this huge kind of like gap in the market where there are a lot of people that have Macs or Chromebooks that basically can't play any games on them. So, it's kind of this been this catch-22 where, people don't want to sort of like make the jump because there's not a market, but there's not a market because people aren't making the jump. So I think there's actually quite a lot of pent-up demand sort of in the alternative desktop space, in as much as, a MacBook is an alternative desktop to Windows.
And there's also this problem with Chromebooks, right? Chromebooks are built on this assumption that the hardware on which they're running is lightweight versus everything is browser based. So they theoretically have lower hardware capability versus some of the other, like a Windows PC or even MacBook. Is that assumption a fair assumption?
That is absolutely a fair assumption. It's really interesting. If you actually, there's a website called ProtonDB, and I love this website. You can basically look at it and see a chart. They sort of have a pie chart of sort of the support matrix for different Steam games on different platforms, and you can see sort of, what games run natively on Linux, not with, Wine Proton Linux, but like actually native on Linux. What games are supported on Chromebook, what games are supported on Mac, and so on. And I think it's pretty telling when you look at the charts and you see that, on native Linux, you can almost count on one or two hands the number of games that are supported on native Linux. The number of games supported on Chromebooks has been 0 since they made the site. The number of games supported on Mac has held steady at about 10 to 15%. I think that number is actually a bit skewed because quite a lot of the games, and I see this all the time when I go through my Steam library, quite a lot of the games that say they support Mac don't actually support Macs anymore. You look at the game in your library and it says, this game might not run on your machine because it requires a 32-bit OS, which hasn't been supported by, Apple devices for, 7-8 years now.
So if you are a serious gamer or a active gamer, so your best bet is still to buy specific gaming hardware like an Xbox or PlayStation. Is that your best bet? Like if you're continuously exploring new games and every week you're playing something.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have just sort of they either go in that camp if that's something that's accessible to them. I think a lot of people would love to have a gaming PC, but like buying a $3,000 or $4,000 gaming PC is just sort of out of the question. I know when I was growing up, that was definitely the case where I would ask my parents like, hey, would you consider buying me this really expensive gaming PC? And they'd be like, if you really want it, you can save up and buy it yourself, which for 10 or 12-year-old kid is, a bit out of reach. So I think there's been sort of a history of people sort of playing what's available to them, not necessarily what they would, love to play ideally. I think you see this a lot on Chromebooks where, I talk with my nephew pretty frequently, and he tells me that, he plays, different games on his Chromebook that his school gave him. A good example of this is, he plays Retro Bowl on his Chromebook, which is a browser game. It's available on a bunch of different, browser-based game websites because he can't play Madden. Like he would love to be able to play Madden, but it's not accessible on a Chromebook. So he's been kind of making do and playing what's available to him, which has been Retro Bowl. But his preference would be to be able to play like Rainbow Siege 6 or Madden on his Chromebook, but he basically can't. So I think, I sort of experienced this as a Mac user where, I would see these new games come out for Windows and I'd be like, oh man, I would really love to be able to play Dead Space, but I can't. So I end up playing Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 again because that's what runs on my Mac. So I think it's kind of in this pattern.
There is this interesting dynamic that happens if you look at like entertainment and media business, that people talk a lot about like Hollywood or streaming business. Netflix sort of surpassed the traditional players like Disney and Warner Brothers and Time Warner.
Mhm.
Um, but if you look at the revenues, actually, like gaming is the biggest entertainment industry, right? I think it
Oh, for
surpasses
sure.
in revenue by a multiple of five, I think, or more. Last time I checked, like I remember it being around 200 billion or something per year. Um, I don't know where it is right now, but um, it like the traditional media industry grabs so much attention while the actual money is being made in gaming and gaming related properties. So I think a lot of people are really unaware of like the size, scale, and you know what the industry actually and who are the main players. Can you give a brief overview of like how do you see gaming industry and how it is split?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is a pretty classic misconception. The gaming industry today is, I might be misquoting the statistic here, but I think it's if you combine movies, television, music, and books together, gaming is bigger by a factor of about 2x. So it's just a really massive market. I think part of the reason people sort of overlook it, even though it's this absolutely humongous market, is because historically gaming has had a bit of a stigma attached to it. A lot of people don't want to identify as gamers. It wasn't that long ago that, the CEOs of some of the larger publishers in the industry were getting called before Congress because people, were sort of making assumptions that video games were corrupting America's youth. I had some really interesting conversations with some folks in the industry where, they had a bit of a rough go because, they would have to go, talk to their congressmen or talk to senators and basically be like, my game, isn't a bad influence on children. It's a creative outlet. And, I think we've come a long way in terms of how video games are perceived. But I think we still have a ways to go before, people really recognize games for what they are, which in my opinion is the highest form of art. I think video games are sort of the pinnacle of artistic media today. It's, a combination of visual elements, musical elements, um, story elements, so like narratives, and then you're kind of synthesizing these things into a single product, which is then interactive. So the user can be, or the person experiencing the art can be immersed in it, and that's really not something that's possible with any other kind of media. I think I could probably wax for a while on why I think games are sort of the the real sort of like benchmark by which other media should be judged. But I think you know if you experience some of the games coming out today, I think they kind of speak for themselves.
And it's also at the cutting edge of technology. Like a lot of what gaming engines are now being used in Hollywood to produce high
Sure.
VFX
Yeah,
shows, right? Like
exactly.
most of the technologies that came out of gaming are the ones now defining traditional media.
Sure. Yeah, I think people were very surprised, but if I'm not mistaken, I think Everything Everywhere All at Once. I'm not sure if you saw this film, but
Yeah, it's a great
they
movie.
heavily utilized Unreal Engine in their VFX to make the film. Um, Pretty incredible results, and I'm not sure how many Oscars it won, but I think it was several. And I think that really says something when you know. Other media is starting to be driven by video games as sort of the key influence. I think you've kind of seen this as well with, a lot of the best stories from games are now being turned into quite successful television shows or movies.
The Last of Us being one of the example, right?
Yeah, it's made it to HBO. So, video games are now becoming prestige television. And I think that's pretty incredible to see because, it really wasn't 10, 15 years ago that, video games were pretty heavily stigmatized for, one reason or another. Um, I think it's funny when you look back at old videos on YouTube about like, you know, there would be these PSA videos put out by different organizations, basically warning parents about the dangers of video games. And I think it's funny to see now because a lot of parents that grew up, in the 80s and 90s are now starting to introduce their young children to video games themselves. So I think we're sort of starting to come full circle. But yeah, in terms of television, Fallout's like another great example. The Super Mario movie, I think, might have been the most successful animated film last year. Nintendo is starting to open up theme parks. It's really incredible to see. So I think there's a very bright future ahead for video games, and I think they're starting to be appreciated more for the art that they are. And I think as we move into the future, that will only continue to become more true.
Can you talk a little bit about like who are the biggest game players and distributors and publishers today?
Sure. There are quite a lot actually, and it varies pretty significantly by region. There's the big Western publishing houses, which video games are kind of interesting. They sort of have it's almost a blend of the dynamics of the film industry and the music industry, where a lot of times you have independent developers that will sign with a label, which would be like a publisher. So I think you saw this with Stardew Valley is sort of a great example of this, where the game was developed by one guy almost entirely. He did pretty much all the art and programming work himself, and then signed with a publisher, which I believe was Chucklefish, for distribution. So you kind of see some of the same dynamics of the record industry playing out in that way.
What does a publisher in gaming industry do for the game creator? Like what value do they bring? Like I can understand that Disney being publisher for a movie, independent movie, like they bring distribution through a theatrical release or doing marketing. Mm-hmm. Like what does a game publisher bring?
It's very similar, and I think the roots of game publishing really go back to sort of the origins of the video game industry, where people were making actual physical copies, like printed discs or cartridges of games, and putting them on store shelves, and then people would go to the stores to buy those games, which to a certain extent is actually still true. With modern consoles, people still go to GameStop, buy games, come home, put the disc in the machine, and play the game. So physical distribution in games is actually surprisingly still fairly significant. I think we're moving more and more to digital every day, but the physical component is still there and real. I think the reason that has persisted is because people like to have a sense of ownership over their games. I would almost put it in the same bucket as people liking to have records, like vinyl records, of their favorite albums. It's very sort of a similar phenomenon, where people just really like the tactile feel of ownership of their games, and like sort of the idea that they're not going to lose access to them and things like that. So I think that's a big part of the reason why physical media has persisted so long in the games industry. But really, I think, when you're looking at the dynamics between publishers and developers of games, it's sort of that historical context that, you really have to understand as to why the industry is the way it is today. Because it wasn't really too long ago that, in order to get your games into players' hands, you had to have a partner with, physical distribution connections, because otherwise, how would you get it to people? So I think sort of with the rise of Steam in the past couple of years and sort of its ascendance in the PC gaming world, that's becoming less and less true every day. And I think Manor Lords is a really good example. This is a game that just went super viral maybe a week or two ago, where it's developed independently, and I don't think they have a real publisher associated with them. They just sort of found their niche audience on Steam and were able to sort of make it successful on their own. But I think a lot of developers are really good at developing games and don't quite have as much experience in marketing and distributing those games. So I think publishers still serve a real and very important role in sort of helping bring art to the masses. It's kind of like just because you're an amazing film director doesn't mean you're an amazing, marketer or distributor of that film. It still is very helpful to partner with a major movie studio, even if you fully have the capability to make the film on your own. Just because there's a lot of, skills and machinery inside those businesses that, help with distribution in a very real and meaningful way.
Let's slightly shift gears and talk about what you guys are doing with Highscore, and how can gamers use Highscore.
Sure. Essentially, what we're doing with Highscore is almost trying to replicate the feeling of having a gaming PC in the cloud. Maybe the closest analogy to what we're doing is if you were to go to AWS and you were to rent a virtual machine and you were to ensure that it has Windows and you were to download and install Steam, and then through Steam, download and install all of your games, and then figure out some third-party solution to stream those games back to yourself, whether that's, Sunshine or Moonlight or Parsec. There's a couple of different solutions. That's really kind of most similar to what we're doing, but that's a terrible user experience to have to try to do that, and requires some technical know-how, which a lot of folks don't have. And we're really putting in the legwork to try to make that a good experience. It's a bit more of a gaming focused UI. So it feels a little bit different, but on the back end, we're trying to preserve a lot of the functionality of, a real gaming PC experience, where we support things like local saves, like mods, sort of things of that nature that you can really only get with an actual gaming PC experience. So it's a bit of a hybrid between, sort of a console-like experience and a pure like virtual desktop. But we probably skew more towards virtual desktop pretty heavily, I would say.
So, while I was doing some research for our conversation, one of the things I was confused is Steam is also saying that it's a cloud streaming platform in one sense, called cloud gaming platform. How is Steam and Highscore different?
Yeah, so Steam's streaming pretty much only works inside the home. So you have to already have a gaming PC with the game installed. And then if you have the gaming PC with the game installed in your house, you can stream it to somewhere else inside your house.
Got it. So this doesn't require, while Highscore doesn't require any of the streaming or having a PC at your home.
Exactly. We take care we take care of all of the infrastructure for you. So we build and run our own servers. We install them in data centers around the country, and the games run on those servers and then are streamed to the user. Whereas with Steam, you actually have to have the gaming PC yourself. There are similar features actually on both Xbox and PlayStation, where, if you have an Xbox in your house or you have a PlayStation in your house and you have a game installed on that PlayStation, you can then stream it to somewhere else in your house. And they're making, devices to sort of make that a better experience. But it's fairly limited because it only works inside of your house. And you also need to have, some real hardware with you to be able to use it.
Having developed cloud applications, this seems like a very hard problem, especially in terms of, if you think about the latency and in generally how compute intensive gamings are. So what does it take for you to take a game and make it compatible for Highscore, and how did you and what does that mean? Whenever there's a new game in the market, how much effort does it take on your side to get it Highscore compatible?
Sure. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about we're essentially taking a lot of the functionality of a gaming PC and trying to replicate that on our service. We're almost game agnostic. We support games programmatically. So when games become available, we don't even necessarily know exactly what people are installing or playing on our service. Users download and install copies of games to play on our service themselves. So when you want to play a game, essentially you see a button first that says install and play. You click it, you wait for it to sort of get installed, and then you're able to play it. But sort of the reason that works is because it essentially is being installed on a Windows gaming PC in the cloud. So if it's compatible with, a standard Windows gaming PC, it's going to work on our service. So we don't have to worry about that too much because, in a very real sense, even though we're very different from just owning a gaming PC, it's a very similar kind of experience in terms of compatibility and what you're able to do with those games and what you're able to play.
So, I mean, one of the observations I made is Google had this project called Stadia, which is sort of similar, right? They promised that, you can just stream games on your browser, but I think they also have a console that they were providing in order to play with it. And I forgot if Xbox had some version of this or if they still do, but Google eventually realized for some reason that they shouldn't be in that business and closed it down, which I felt like was a premature decision because consider gaming is such a big industry. And Google being Google, I thought it was a significant industry to be part of. And I thought that decision was a little bit premature. But have you looked into why they stopped, Google Stadia, and have you looked into the strategy behind that?
Yeah, pretty extensively actually. And I've spoken to a bunch of folks, both that worked on the project and were on the publisher side, on the other side of the table from Google with this. I think ultimately Stadia's failure boils down to games. In gaming, at the end of the day, it's all about the games. And I think Nintendo's done a very good job of showing that this is true, where they've sort of always beaten their own path and, had alternative approaches to hardware. And because they have Mario and Zelda and Metroid and Pokemon, people will go where the Nintendo games are. And I think that's sort of been true historically throughout the game industry. If you look back in the 80s when there was the big video game crash, you look at why that happened, it's because the games weren't good. There weren't very many good games. Like a lot of the games that were being put out were very low quality. And I think you've sort of seen this recur over and over and over again where, gamers go where the games are. And I think this was a big part of Stadia's problem, which when the service shut down, they had about 300 games total on the service. And from the publisher side, it was really difficult to bring games to Stadia because they had to be ported to Linux, and not just, Wine Proton Linux like the Steam Deck supports, but like Google's internal version of Linux. And it was a really non-trivial, task to be able to bring a game to Stadia. And from my understanding, Google provided not insignificant support to publishers to make this possible. For context, Steam adds about 40 games a day to their service. So when you have 300 games total, hopefully that provides a little bit of perspective on the delta there in terms of what's available to play. So I remember I tried out Stadia myself when it came out, and there were 5 games on the service. I played Assassin's Creed for a little while. Not a huge Assassin's Creed player. I got bored after a little bit. And then I never came back to the service because they didn't have any games that I was interested in. I think I briefly came back to the service when they added support for Cyberpunk, and they were one of the only places that you could play Cyberpunk where it actually well. But after I played Cyberpunk, then I didn't have a reason to continue using the service. So I think ultimately it boils down to game selection on Google's side and the infrastructure choices that they made that sort of caused issues, in terms of game compatibility. They had a lot of really interesting ideas, and I think they did a lot of things really well. In terms of streaming, the service actually worked very well, and I think they showed that, with the right infrastructure, it's possible. When Google was doing this, one of the really big things that they did was they actually had custom silicon as part of, their infrastructure. It wasn't really possible to do with off-the-shelf hardware, but I think we're just now reaching the point where with off-the-shelf hardware, this is actually feasible to do and to build a service, that's comparable or superior in quality to what Google was able to offer. So it's kind of interesting to see how it's evolved just in the past couple of years. But I think if you really dive deep on Stadia, ultimately it boils down to games and the decisions that sort of led to the problem with game selection.
So in summary, on the user side, they didn't have enough games to continue playing, and on the publisher side, it was not easy to get those service to get new games onto the service for
Yeah,
big
it was very
developers.
difficult to bring your games to Stadia. And then on the user side, basically because of this, they just didn't have enough content to really keep the service interesting for, a majority of users. So
Yeah,
I think,
but I still felt like it is such a big industry. Like if I was the decision maker, I would, sort of reiterate and change the direction.
I think it's a really good example of, infinite money doesn't buy good decision making. And I think we've seen this play out in many industries over time where, just because someone is, a huge player or the incumbent, they don't always necessarily make the best decisions for, a new market that's opening up. And I think there's a lot to be learned from Stadia, and I think they had some great ideas. But I think ultimately, it was their game to lose, and they let it go. So,
And you mentioned, you're announcing something new soon. Can you talk about your announcement?
sure. Actually, we just announced this earlier this week that our alpha for Highscore is going to be launching in the fall. So we're kind of turning the bend on development. The end is in sight. Not necessarily the end. I don't know that we'll ever be fully finished, but a fully, user-ready, playable version of the service is within sight. So we're very excited to get this into players' hands. We've been playing around with it a bunch internally and with some of our friends, but it's been pretty close so far. I would say the interface in its current state is not as beautiful as it could be, but I think very shortly we'll be there. So I'm
Well,
excited.
if you're not embarrassed about your first version, then you're too late. Didn't someone say this about startups?
That's true, but in order to play right now, I don't know if you're familiar with like Swagger UI or
Yeah.
the open. You have to configure everything through Swagger at the moment.
Oh,
So
okay.
not beautiful is a bit of an understatement. So
Well, I mean, that's an exciting announcement. How many games are going to be available on day one of alpha?
day one, we are going to have full Steam support. So that is to say, every game on Steam is going to be supported on our service, which is over 150,000 games. So
Wow. So 300 on Google Stadia versus 150 on Highscore. When I think this is a good example when someone says, why are you competing with a big company which could do the same thing? I think, as you said, like just because you have infinite money doesn't mean you have good decision making. So another follow-up question: how are you going to charge users for Highscore?
sure, it's a monthly subscription depending on the level of service that you want. So basically, you choose kind of the level of performance that you're looking for. So if you want, 1080p, 60 FPS, that costs a certain amount per month. If you want 4K, 120 FPS, that costs, a bit more. And that's basically it. You choose the level of service that you're looking for, and it's a simple monthly subscription. So you connect your Steam account when you sign up. You can see the games that you own and have licenses to, and then we sort of let you install those games and stream them back to yourself.
Got it. So other interesting question, or I thought an interesting topic that we could cover is um, if you are starting or if you're trying to make a new game today, or if you just want to be in gaming industry, what are like the opportunities you see, whether it being on development side or publishing side or distribution side? Like, what are the opportunities if someone is looking into getting into the gaming industry? Like, where are the opportunities you see that are sort of big trends that will happen or soon to happen in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think what you're really seeing that's super interesting in the gaming world is there's kind of this bifurcation happening where, you're seeing the rise of indies on one side because making a game yourself has never been more accessible. At least, within an indie scope.
And why
So
is that? Is that because of like Unreal Engine and the two
Mhm.
gaming engines, or is it beyond that?
Exactly. The tools are just getting better. Creating art assets and sort of the art pipeline is becoming more accessible to individuals. AI is doing a bit to help with this. but really like the tooling with Unity, Unreal Engine, Game Maker, etc., just becoming better and better and better with each passing year is really just making it more accessible to more folks. But then on the other side, really what you're seeing is AAA is becoming, I mean, not that it wasn't before, but is very much becoming the exclusive domain of incredibly large publishing houses. The cost to make AAA titles is, you should look at a curve of how that's been increasing over time. It's pretty crazy. I think Microsoft said something along the lines of the average AAA title costs over $100 million to make now, which, there aren't too many firms out there that have the resources to make games like that and sort of survive hits. I think it's a very similar kind of problem that we're starting to see in gaming on the AAA side, which we've kind of already seen in movies where, the budgets for, big films are becoming so exorbitant that people aren't really willing to take as many risks in terms of, new concepts and ideas and original IP. They're mostly sort of, making new versions of old stories, new superhero movies, the next Superman, Spider-Man, etc. Because it's a safe bet, and it's very understandable on the studio side where they would do this, and consumers love it. Nobody's ever gonna not go see the next Batman movie. But I think you're starting to see a very similar trend in games where the cost of AAA development is becoming, so great that the big publishing houses, when they invest into new IP, are very, very conservative in how they're kind of approaching it. And I think you kind of see this. Grand Theft Auto is like a great example where, the cost to develop GTA 5 was incredible. I think cost a couple $100 million for them to develop that game. And then, it has almost evolved into a kind of live services game where they've kept adding new content to an existing successful IP. Because the risk of introducing a new iteration of that IP is so great, cost aside. So I think, we're a lot more likely to see Grand Theft Auto 7 10 years from now than we are to see, a brand new IP from a firm like Rockstar. And I think the reasons for that are very understandable. Personally, I think the sort of the right balance was the PS2 era. I think, during the PS2 era, it was, the cost of AAA development wasn't so high that publishers could take a lot of risks in terms of the, games that are getting developed and published. So I think you saw this like explosion of creativity and all these new ideas of, games coming out. But I think sort of as we've moved through these successive console generations, you can kind of see the narrowing of, the sort of risks that are being taken with each successive generation. So you kind of saw, a bit of a narrowing in the PS3 era, a bit more of narrowing in the PS4 era, and the PS5 era. It's narrower still. So I think it's kind of interesting to look at how this is sort of evolving and developing.
So another sort of interesting trend that is happening right now is, I think all the media companies or pseudo media companies, which are really internet first companies like YouTube, Netflix, even LinkedIn is now into gaming. Like LinkedIn has games, mostly educational type of games. YouTube, has games in their app, which are, I think previously called as Game Snacks. Whose product manager was on podcast, and we discussed about it in our conversation. And Netflix is also heavily investing in gaming. Did you observe anything interesting with Netflix coming to gaming, or have they made any interesting moves that caught your attention?
I mean, I think really like all of these players moving into gaming is just a recognition of how large the market really is. I think every platform sort of has their own approach to gaming and what makes sense for their own personal context. But I think gaming is such a big space that really there's a lot of opportunity for multiple people to win. And I think it's kind of interesting when you look at it from a 10,000 foot perspective where the gaming world is so large and there's such a diversity of approach to the form factors in which you can game. that I think I encourage more people to come into the gaming space because I think there's room for many winners. I think, there are obviously going to be some big winners and big players in the space, and there already are, and I think that will continue to be true. But I think there's a lot of room for everyone, and I think on balance, it's a good thing if people are playing more games and experiencing more art.
I think that's a good space, sort of to end our conversation. I think this has been a great conversation about gaming industry. One last question before we end the conversation: who are people or blogs or sources of information about gaming that you follow, to understand what's happening in gaming?
Sure. I personally really love following indie developers on Twitter. So like there's a number of names that I could throw out of folks that I really enjoy following. But maybe some quick names would just be I really enjoy following Concerned Ape, Eric Baroni. He's the guy behind Stardew Valley. I really enjoy following Jonathan Blow, who's famous for The Witness and Braid, which really smart, phenomenal developer. And Ed McMillan might actually be my favorite. Who he doesn't live too far from me in San Francisco. He's just based down in Watsonville, which is near Santa Cruz. But his art style is unbelievable, amazing. He's got some new games coming out. One of the old favorites of mine is Isaac, and just really, really incredible artists, like super talented guy. So I love following these folks on Twitter. It's fun to kind of see the antics that they have on a daily basis.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Thanks for coming on the show and sharing, amazing insights around gaming, and all the best for the alpha release.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the time. Great being here.